going to jump in today. We're going to talk a little bit about something that's been in the news the last few days, and that's a leadership change at IBM. And, there was a late Friday news dump announcing that IBM president and former Red Hat CEO Jim Whitehurst was stepping down. And this came as a surprise to many, as Jim was largely viewed as a likely successor to IBM CEO Arvind Krishna. And so some backstory there. So Jim had been running Red Hat since about 2007, the open source software giant. And he kept his title after IBM's massive acquisition of the company for $34 billion 2 years ago. And, one thing I noted was that IBM shares were down as of yesterday about 5% since the company announced Whitehurst's departure. And I think that really shows the high regard that Jim was held throughout the investor community and the tech community. So, I'm sure that Jim's next act is going to be an amazing one. And one of the things I noticed today was in an interview that he did with Barron's, I think yesterday, he indicated that he wants another chance to be a CEO. And he knew that became clear that wasn't going to happen while he was at IBM. And he knew that, as soon as the board of directors chose Krishna, who at 59 years of age is about 5 years older than Whitehurst. They selected Krishna to kind of lead them through as their CEO. And so he knew that it was probably time for him to make a change. And so I'm really looking forward to whatever it is he does next, because he has an amazing track record and I'm sure it'll be great.
Well, I think it's really interesting that he mentioned that in the Barron's piece. Typically, IBM CEOs check out about age 60.
Right.
I know Ginny was due to do that and hung around an extra year for the Red Hat. I know Sam Parmesan before her checked out at 60. So Krishna being 59 and Jim not thinking the opportunities there for him was an interesting one for me. That's how I read it. Being an ex-IBMer, a lot of us thought that Arvind was going to take the company through the Kyndryd split that's due to happen.
Right.
There's a lot transformationally going on within IBM now. Go through that split, and then 2022, he'd get that all done, and then step down and Jim would naturally take over. So I'm really surprised that Whitehurst has stood down.
Yeah.
I thought he would keep his role as president, see Arvind in the spotlight making the big transformational changes that IBM's going through right now. And chatting to IBM execs over the last couple of days about it, they're as surprised as I am that Jim's not the next person in charge of IBM, in the 22 timeframe. So I think great from Whitehurst's ego that the share price dropped within 90 minutes and took sort of $5 or $6 off the share price. That must be great that you're that highly valued. But I think the view within IBM is going to be really interesting. I think a lot of traditional IBMers were really excited by Whitehurst. He was taking quite a prominent role in messaging to the IBMers. And I think from the Red Hat side, there was a lot of interest in him retaining that role and being seen as the Red Hat person in the executive ranks at IBM. So it's really going to be interesting how those kind of constituencies react to the news. I'd expect that the Red Hatters are going to be quite unsettled by the news of Jim moving on, and the IBMers correspondingly a little disappointed that such an industry luminary isn't going to be in the executive ranks sort of guiding the journey that they're on their hybrid cloud strategy.
Right. Well, you know what? We will see how it plays out.
It's going to be really interesting to see where Whitehurst lands. I mean, he's on a stellar run and got a lot of runway left in his career. The work he did at Delta as COO was seen as really strong. Absolutely. He took Red Hat to be the first $1 billion open source company, the first 2 billion open source, the first 3 billion open source, and then ultimately sold the business out for 34 billion. So he's going to be a hot property, and it'd be really interesting to see where he lands.
He is indeed. And to your point about, the Red Hat community, I mean, obviously there'll be disappointment and, sort of uncertainty and everything else. But, the reality of it is with any career path, right? There's never a given. There's always uncertainty. There's always change. And so it will really be interesting to watch, how this transpires, how IBM motors on, and, where Jim Whitehurst ends up. And we, of course, wish him the best. And so it will be very interesting to watch. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in this segment of our show is, you are a former IBMer for a very long time. We're so happy to have you as part of our team, by the way. And so there have been some other changes at IBM that I wanted you to touch on, some changes as it relates to, sales and marketing structure and that sort of thing. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think if you're not tracking IBM closely, you'll see point announcements coming out. They announced a new CMO with Carla Piñeyro Sublett. Mm-hmm. They announced a new CIO with Kathryn Guarini, who used to be my boss, actually, in a previous role. And you'll see those as just point announcements, not a lot of fanfare. But when you see them in the aggregate and you see them as a whole, IBM's on a complete transformation.
Yeah.
You've got the big Kyndryd split going on where they're spinning off what used to be the global technology services business. That is a quarter of the company, both revenue and headcount wise. About 90,000 people are leaving the business to go and form Kyndryd. That's about $20 billion a year worth of annual revenue. So that's significant.
Right.
That's meaning an impact onto how they run some of the back-end processes. And Kathryn's having an interesting couple of weeks with the email migration that's going on, chatting to some of the IBMers. They've had a bumpy ride with email and calendaring over the last couple of weeks.
And you don't think about this, but when you're in sales and it's the month end,
it's half end for IBM as well. So they've had, chatting to a few former colleagues, it's been interesting trying to trace down purchase orders. So I'll be watching their Q2 earnings to see whether there was a blip. They just announced razor thin growth numbers last quarter. So any blip is going to be material to see whether they squeak over into revenue growth. But I mean, I talked about the marketing. I talked about some of the IT changes. They're having to carve off a quarter of the company. There's GTS used to do a lot of the operational management of the IBM systems in GTS data centers. That's got to be span out. IBM's also going through an email change. They're going through a CRM change. They've gone through a sales and go-to-market change. So there's a lot of transformational stuff all going on at once within IBM right now. And I think what's interesting for me is this is probably the same scale of transformation that IBM went through under Lou Gerstner.
Right.
But it's getting a lot less press. So I think the piece we did, Daniel and I, on the executive leadership, Jim Whitehurst got a lot of the news, and we've just talked about that.
Right.
I think if you're watching IBM closely, there is a lot going on under the surface that's not getting news. Kathryn Guarini taking over from the previous CIO isn't really newsworthy, but it speaks to something that going on there. Also the marketing changing. They've just announced a marketing reorganization, root and branch. Carla came on board I think about February time. She's taken some time to analyze the business. And, I see my LinkedIn changing with all my colleagues over there. That's just hit a huge marketing reorganization to realign from a product focused and BU focused to conversations with clients. So I think the key takeaway from this, Shelly, is there is a lot going on at IBM right now. And I think Arvind is undertaking the same scale and magnitude of transformation that Lou Gerstner took in the, mid to late 90s. So it's going to be really interesting. IBM is being very, very thoughtful about getting back to growth.
Yeah.
Everything is growth. And I think all this transformation is laser focused on getting back to revenue growth.
One thing I wanted to touch on that I think that you mentioned either in a conversation or a bit in the article that you co-wrote with Daniel was a change in go-to-market strategy on the part of IBM, and how that may potentially impact customers.
Yeah, it's really interesting. They rolled this out at the start of the year. And having been at IBM 10 years, it was a very relationship-focused client exec model with almost a minor on revenue in how those client execs were paid and measured. It was very much on relationship metrics and the overall relationship dynamic with their biggest clients.
Mm-hmm.
What they've done is they've rolled out a couple of different segments of how they manage their clients. And this was fragmented, and various business units would segment clients in different ways. What's really obvious now is you're either part of segment 1, which is the top 500 relationships IBM has globally, or you're in segment 2. What that means for you as a client, if you're wondering kind of where am I, is not much change in segment 1. The client exec structure still exists, still very strategic relationship focus. In segment 2, however, massive change. A lot of client execs left the business as the transition in January, or got given different roles. And what that means is in segment 2, those sort of almost second tier of accounts, if you want to call it that, they're going to take a technology-driven focus. And I think this is a returning to focus from IBM of we need to go and drive some of those technology conversations with our clients, really engage with them and interact differently with them around how they position technology. And I think that's a competitive response to how some of their competitors, the AWSs, the Azures, the sort of GCPs out there, are engaging with their clients on a more technology lens and less on a relationship lens. And I think it's going to be interesting. That's only sort of 6 months in for IBM, and that's a massive change. And the lady who rolled that out, Bridget, was one of the people who was announced on Friday that she's going to be leaving the business. So she was asked to hang around to roll out that change. It's going to be interesting to see how IBM doubles down on that going forward.
And how, the lifespan of those changes,
So, still massive change for IBM of how they go to market.
Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned in our prior conversation about it was just customers in that tier 2 level will have to get used to a different kind of relationship, different kind of treatment, perhaps not quite as high touch, not quite as personal. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's, when you're used to very personalized, high touch, and you transition away from that, there's always a danger in that. So I think the challenge with IBM there will be, how can we transition these customers into these tiers? How do we keep these tier 2 customers happy and feeling like they're getting what it is they want from IBM, what it is they deserve out of this relationship? So that'll be interesting.
I think it's going to be even more interesting as Kyndryd happens in the sort of September, October time. A lot of those big multi-$100 million relationships are Kyndryd relationships that form part of that $20 billion. So it's going to be interesting to see how an account that was maybe led by GTS, the sort of now Kyndryd business, transitions to being an IBM-led relationship as Kyndryd splits off. So that's going to be fascinating, I think.
Much ahead, that is for sure.
Yes, busy year for Arvind now.
Absolutely.